The sound room aboard a Project 671 RTM Victor III attack submarine somewhere in the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, late 1982. Hydrophone operators of the Soviet Northern Fleet's 33rd Submarine Division had been trained on a specific signature: the cavitation of a Polaris-armed British boat at patrol speed, the 70 Hz hum of its turbo generators, the periodic chuff of its trash disposal unit. For weeks the operators heard the ambient noise of the deep Atlantic and nothing else. HMS Resolution, HMS Repulse, HMS Renown, and HMS Revenge. The 4 Resolution-class boats of the 10th Submarine Squadron, based at Faslane, on the Gareloch, were each at sea on rotation, one always on deterrent patrol. The Soviets knew this. They could not find them. The British called it Operation Relentless, the unbroken cycle of nuclear-armed patrols begun on June 15, 1968, when Resolution slipped out of the Clyde with 16 Polaris-era missiles in her tubes. By the early 1980s, the run had passed 5,000 days without a gap. Each patrol lasted roughly 8 to 10 weeks. Each boat carried 143 officers and ratings, 2 crews rotating, port and starboard, and a single sealed envelope in the captain's safe, known officially as the Letter of Last Resort, handwritten by the serving Prime Minister, and addressed to the commanding officer in the event that the United Kingdom had ceased to exist. Margaret Thatcher wrote hers in May 1979, within days of taking office. The contents have never been released. Harold Wilson, James Callaghan, Edward Heath, each had performed the same ritual at a desk in 10 Downing Street, alone, the door shut. The Cabinet Office burnt the previous letters unopened when a new Prime Minister took the pen. Faslane sat at the head of a loch ringed by hills, 25 miles northwest of Glasgow. The base had been chosen in 1963 over alternatives at Falmouth and Milford Haven, because the geography made acoustic detection of departing submarines nearly impossible. A boat leaving the Gareloch passed beneath the Rue Narrows, threaded the Firth of Clyde, and dropped into deep water west of the Mole of Kintyre within hours. Soviet trawlers, the AGI vessels, Auxiliary General Intelligence in NATO parlance, loitered off the Irish coast year-round, antennae trained on the western approaches. The Royal Navy's Counter-Detection Unit, based at HMS Osprey at Portland, plotted them in real time. The boats themselves were quiet by the standards of 1968 and obsolescent by the standards of 1982. The Resolution class displaced 8,400 tons submerged, ran on a single English electric pressurized water reactor of British design, and reached perhaps 25 knots dived. The American Lafayette class, on which they were modelled, was marginally quieter. What the British added was tactical discipline of an almost monastic kind. A patrol report from HMS Repulse for the period August to October 1979, declassified to the National Archives at Kew under reference ADM 344, records the boat conducting only 13 periscope exposures across 61 days at sea, each lasting under 9 seconds. The reactor was run at minimum power consistent with hotel load. Cooks worked in soft shoes. Films were shown without sound on alternate Wednesdays. The boat had effectively vanished from the surface of the planet for 2 months. In Moscow, the GRU's Naval Intelligence Directorate had a name for the British problem. They called it the Faslane Silence. By the autumn of 1982, a Soviet officer in the Northern Fleet's anti-submarine warfare staff had been ordered to write a paper explaining it. The officer's paper, the existence of which was confirmed only after 1991 through interviews conducted by the historian Christopher Andrew, identified 3 intersecting failures. The Soviets could not solve any of them in time. The first was acoustic. By 1982, Soviet hydrophone technology had advanced, but the standard towed array fitted to the Victor III class, itself a closely guarded improvement on earlier hulls, was tuned to detect the discrete tonals of an American boomer. British Polaris boats had been retrofitted between 1972 and 1978 under a program called Chevaline, formally approved by Edward Heath's cabinet on December 6, 1973, and continued in secret by Harold Wilson after the February 1974 election. Chevaline was nominally about the missile front end, penetration aids and decoys to defeat the Galosh ABM system around Moscow. But the work at the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston demanded a parallel acoustic refit. Tile cladding, raft-mounted machinery, redesigned propulsors. The boats came out of the Vickers Yard at Barrow in Furness, sounding different from American Lafayette's, and the Soviet libraries were never properly updated. The second failure was geographic. The Royal Navy's patrol box was a rectangle of ocean, of which only the 4 submarine captains, the flag officer submarines at Northwood, and a handful of cleared officers at the Ministry of Defence knew the boundaries. The box moved. It might lie in the Norwegian Sea one month, the Rockall Trough the next, occasionally further south towards the Bay of Biscay. The Soviets assumed the British, like the Americans, would station their boats where their missiles could best range Moscow. Polaris A3 had a range of 2,500 nautical miles. From almost anywhere in the eastern North Atlantic, the warheads could reach the Kremlin. The third failure was human. Vasilin had been infiltrated, but not effectively. In April 1985, the Security Service, MI5, would arrest a civilian clerk at the Clyde submarine base named Lance Corporal Philip Aldridge. Actually, that case concerned the Ministry of Defence in London. The Vasilin penetrations were smaller. A galley hand, a junior rating turned by a Czech intermediary in Glasgow, both detected by the Royal Navy's own Internal Security Service, before they could pass deployment schedules. The information that did reach Soviet hands tended to be stale by weeks. Sir Frank Cooper, Permanent Undersecretary at the Ministry of Defence from 1976 to 1982, observed in a 1991 interview with the historian Peter Hennessy that the deterrent functioned because 3 departments, the MOD, the Cabinet Office and the Treasury, had built a system in which fewer than 30 serving officials at any moment knew where the on-patrol boat actually was. Cooper called it the smallest secret in Whitehall and the largest in the country. The phrase has been disputed. Hennessy's transcript, lodged in his papers at Queen Mary University of London, gives the tightest secret rather than the smallest. Historians differ on which Cooper said and whether the distinction matters. The point survived translation. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired through the late 1970s by Sir Anthony Duff, received summaries of deterrent operations only at the level of patrol commenced and patrol completed. Not the location, not the targeting. The JIC, the apex body of British intelligence assessment, was kept blind by design. In the spring of 1983, the Soviet First Chief Directorate of the KGB launched Operation Ryan, Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie nuclear missile attack, driven by Yuri Andropov's conviction that NATO was preparing a first strike. Ryan demanded surveillance of the British deterrent as a leading indicator. The Soviets did not get it. Their failure to find the British boats fed Andropov's paranoia rather than calming it. Clement Attlee took the decision in January 1947. The minute GEN 163/13 was drafted in a cabinet committee whose existence was kept from most of the cabinet, let alone Parliament. Britain would build an atomic bomb. The Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, having returned from a meeting at which the United States Secretary of State, James Burns, had been condescending about British nuclear ambitions, was reported to have said something approximating, "We've got to have this thing over here whatever it costs. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack on top of it." The exact wording is contested. Sir Michael Quinlan, later Permanent Undersecretary at the MOD, told Peter Hennessy in 1988 that Bevin's actual phrasing was probably milder. The version that circulated was a Whitehall improvement. The bomb worked. On October 3, 1952, in the Montebello Islands off the western Australian coast, the device codenamed Hurricane detonated inside the hull of the frigate HMS Plym, which had been towed there for the purpose. The yield was 25 kilotons. Britain became the third nuclear power. Delivering the weapon was a separate problem. The Royal Air Force's V-bomber force, Valiant, Victor, Vulcan, entered service between 1955 and 1957. The Vulcan B.2, with its delta wing and 4 Bristol Olympus engines, could carry the Yellow Sun Mark II thermonuclear weapon at 56,000 feet over a combat radius of 1,725 nautical miles. From bases at Scampton, Waddington, Coningsby and Cottesmore, the V-Force could, in theory, put nuclear weapons on targets in Western Russia within 4 hours of the order to scramble. In theory. By the late 1950s, Soviet surface-to-air missiles, principally the S-75 Diviner, the system that would shoot down Francis Gary Powers's U-2 over Sverdlovsk on May 1, 1960, had rendered high-altitude penetration nearly suicidal. The V-Force shifted to low-level attack profiles in 1963, hugging terrain at 250 feet to reach their targets. Crew life expectancy in a real strike, calculated internally at Bomber Command, was measured in single flights. Harold Macmillan, Prime Minister from January 1957, understood the maths. He had inherited the Sandys Defence Review of April 1957, which had cancelled most manned aircraft development in favour of missiles, and a programme called Blue Streak, a liquid-fuelled intermediate-range ballistic missile being built at Stevenage by de Havilland. Blue Streak was vulnerable on the ground. It took 15 minutes to fuel. A Soviet first strike against its planned silos at Spadadam in Cumbria would have caught the missiles being prepared. Macmillan cancelled Blue Streak as a military weapon on April 13, 1960. The replacement, an American air-launched ballistic missile called Skybolt, to be carried by modified Vulcans, was cancelled by the United States on December 11, 1962. Macmillan flew to Nassau in the Bahamas 8 days later to meet President John F. Kennedy. The meetings ran from December 18th to 21st. Macmillan, by his own account in his diaries lodged at the Bodleian Library, was in a corner of a corner. He came out with Polaris. The Nassau Agreement, signed on December 21, 1962, committed the United States to supply Polaris A-3 missiles to the United Kingdom. Britain would build its own submarines and its own warheads. The American missiles would carry the British bombs. 4 submarines designed at Bath, built at Barrow and Birkenhead. The first keel was laid in February 1964. Resolution commissioned on October 2, 1967. The first operational patrol began the following summer. The man who had to make the system work at sea was Vice Admiral Sir Hugh Mackenzie, the first Chief Polaris executive. He had 3 years to deliver a force the Americans had taken twice that long to field. Mackenzie set up shop in Fox Hill, Bath, in a wartime hutted compound that still smelt of creosote. He had a staff of 12 when he started in July 1963. By 1968, the Polaris program employed 7,000 people across the United Kingdom and cost £405 million. Under budget. On time, the only major British defence programme of the 1960s to achieve both. Treasury officials in Great George Street, accustomed to demanding extra estimates for everything from the TSR-2 to the Concorde, remarked on the anomaly. The British Polaris boats differed from their American cousins in details that mattered. The hull was slightly longer, 425 feet against the Lafayette's 425 feet, broadly identical, but the missile compartment was British-built and the navigation system was modified to suit Royal Navy practice. The reactor compartment was British, derived from work at the Admiralty Research Laboratory at Downray on the North Scottish coast and built by Rolls-Royce and Associates at Rainsway in Derby. The warhead, designated ET.317, was designed at Aldermaston and manufactured at the Royal Ordnance Factory at Bergfield. Each Polaris A-3 carried 3 of these warheads in a clustered re-entry vehicle, not independently targetable despite later Soviet assumptions. The crews trained at the Polaris school at Chevaline, set up in a former hut camp on the eastern side of the Gareloch. Training emphasized silent running to the point of fetishism. Petty officers conducted what were known as rig for ultra-quiet drills, in which every machine not essential to immediate survival was shut down. The boat would coast on residual reactor heat. Air conditioning ceased, internal temperatures climbed. Crews wore plimsolls. The first commanding officer of HMS Resolution was Commander Michael Henry, RN, a submariner who had served on conventional patrol boats in the Mediterranean during the Suez Crisis. He took Resolution to sea for her first deterrent patrol on June 15, 1968, departing Chevaline at 02:30 on the morning ebb. The boat carried 16 Polaris-A-3 missiles, 48 warheads in total, and a sealed envelope from Harold Wilson. What that envelope contained was a matter of speculation for 30 years and remains so. Wilson reportedly told a small group at Chequers that he had written the boats to attempt to put themselves under Australian or American command if Britain was destroyed. But the source for this is a single 1976 conversation, reported secondhand by Bernard Donoghue, Wilson's policy advisor, and the historian Peter Hennessy has expressed caution about the recollection. The alternatives in the standard 4-option template offered to each Prime Minister were: retaliate, do not retaliate, place yourself under Allied command, use your own judgment. The on-patrol boat received nothing but routine traffic on the very low-frequency broadcasts from the Royal Navy transmitter at Criggion in Shropshire and after 1985 from Anthorn in Cumbria. Silence was normal. Silence meant Britain still existed. Long silence at 24 hours 48:72 meant the captain would begin a procedure laid down in MOD confidential book CB 889, the operational orders for the deterrent commander, the precise terms of which have never been declassified. By 1969 the rotation worked. One boat at sea, one returning, one preparing, one in refit at Rosyth Dockyard on the Firth of Forth. The cycle began to run. It has not stopped since. The Soviet response was to try harder. In the summer of 1970, a new generation of Soviet attack submarines, the Project 671 Victor I class, began deploying in numbers into the North Atlantic. They had been built specifically to hunt NATO ballistic missile submarines. The British had to disappear from them. The Greenland-Iceland-UK gap is roughly 900 nautical miles wide at its narrowest, a triangle of cold North Atlantic water through which every Soviet submarine bound for the open ocean had to pass. The American Navy had laid SOSUS, the sound surveillance system, across the bottom of the gap in the 1950s. Chains of hydrophones cabled back to processing stations, including a major facility at Brawdy in Pembrokeshire activated in 1974. SOSUS could detect a Soviet boat crossing the gap with high probability. It could not with the same precision find a British boat that had already passed through. The Royal Navy's own sonar work was conducted from a research establishment at Portland, the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment, where engineers worked through the 1960s and 1970s on towed array sonar of increasing sophistication. The 2046 array, fitted to Royal Navy hunter-killer submarines including the Swiftsure and later Trafalgar classes, gave a passive detection range against a Victor-class boat of perhaps 50 nautical miles in good conditions. The Soviets had nothing comparable until well into the 1980s. The British exploited the asymmetry. While Polaris boats hid, hunter-killers stalked. HMS Conqueror, a Churchill-class boat under the command of Commander Christopher Reeford Brown, had spent the late 1970s shadowing Soviet boats in the Norwegian Sea. Conqueror was the boat that would, in May 1982, sink the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano with Mark 8 torpedoes during the Falklands conflict, the only nuclear-powered submarine to sink a surface warship in combat. The same boat the previous year had recovered a section of Soviet towed array cable from the Barents Sea in an operation codenamed Barmaid, the details of which were not officially acknowledged until journalist Ian Ballantyne published an account in 2013, drawing on interviews with Reeford Brown and surviving crew. The Ministry of Defence has neither confirmed nor denied the operation. Barmaid, if it occurred as described, gave British intelligence access to the Soviet hydrophone library, the recorded acoustic signatures the Soviets had built up of NATO submarines. Knowing what the enemy thought you sounded like permitted the most precise of all forms of deception, sounding like something else. The government communications headquarters at Cheltenham contributed in parallel. GCHQ had broken into Soviet naval communications systems during the 1970s in collaboration with the American National Security Agency at Fort Meade. The product distributed inside the British system as Umbra-class material under the Brucer Agreement of 1943, by then renamed UK-USA, flowed to a small cell within the Defence Intelligence Staff in the MOD's main building in Whitehall. The cell, known as DI-4, Navy, included officers who had served in submarines. They read the Soviet hunt orders in close to real time. The boats at sea did not know they were being protected by this stream of intelligence. The captain of a Polaris submarine on patrol broadcast nothing and received only routine traffic. The Joint Intelligence Committee assessment in 1978, written under the chairmanship of Sir Anthony Duff, concluded that no Polaris patrol had been compromised by Soviet detection during the preceding decade. The phrase used in the JIC paper, partially declassified in 2010 to the National Archives under reference CAB 186, was that the Soviet Navy's ability to localize British SSBN units remained negligible. What the Soviets did acquire by espionage was scraps. Jeffrey Prime, a Russian linguist at GCHQ, was arrested in April 1982 after his arrest for unrelated child sex offences led to the discovery of his Soviet handling. Prime had given the KGB material on Western signals intelligence operations since 1968. Whether he passed material specifically on Polaris is unclear from the trial record. The prosecution at the Old Bailey in November 1982 concentrated on broader categories of damage. A second case was about to break. Michael Bettany, a desk officer in MI5's K branch, posted documents on Soviet illegals to the London residency of the KGB through the letterbox of Arkady Guk, the resident, on April 3, 1983. Guk, suspecting a provocation by the British Security Service, threw them away. The KGB had not yet realized that Oleg Gordievsky, the deputy resident, was working for MI6. Gordievsky reported the approach. Bettany was arrested in September 1983 and sentenced at the Old Bailey in April 1984 to 23 years. Sir John Jones, the Director General of MI5, took early retirement in the aftermath. The Bettany case mattered to the deterrent only at the margins. He had access to counterintelligence, not submarine operations. But it occurred in the months when the British state was most concerned about Soviet penetration of its strategic posture. The autumn of 1983 was the period of Able Archer 83, the NATO command post exercise running from 7 to 11 November, during which Soviet intelligence indicators picked up by Gordievsky and reported through MI6's R5 section to the Joint Intelligence Committee suggested that the Politburo had genuinely feared a NATO first strike was about to begin. The JIC's response, drafted by its chairman Sir Anthony Ackland and circulated to a distribution list of 8, including Margaret Thatcher, recommended that NATO modify the exercise pattern in subsequent years to reduce ambiguity. Thatcher read the paper at Chequers on the weekend of December 8th to 9th, 1983. Her marginalia, preserved in the Thatcher MSS at Churchill Archives Centre in Cambridge, indicated agreement and a request for more from G. Gordievsky. The Polaris patrol continued throughout. HMS Renown was on station for the duration of Able Archer, having sailed from Faslane in late September. Her commanding officer was not informed of the political temperature in Moscow. He could not have been. The boat received only routine VLF traffic. Had the order come, it would have come unambiguously. Through this period, the Soviet effort to find British boomers shifted from acoustic to other domains. The GRU recruited an agent at the Vickers shipyard at Barrow in Furness, a draftsman named only as Sherwood, in fragmentary KGB archives later examined by Vasili Mitrokhin, the archivist of the KGB First Chief Directorate, who defected to MI6 in November 1992 and brought with him 6 trunks of notes. The Sherwood material related to the next generation of British submarines, the Vanguard class then in design, which would carry Trident D5 missiles to replace Polaris. Sherwood was never identified, never prosecuted. The case remained internal to MI5's investigation. The Vanguard program had been authorized by Margaret Thatcher's government in July 1980, with the Defence Secretary Francis Pym writing to John Nott, his successor, that the decision was the most important defence judgment we shall take in this Parliament. The cost was estimated at £5 billion, eventually £12.57 billion in 1995 prices. The first boat would not enter service until 1993, 2 years after the Cold War formally ended. For the duration of the Cold War then, the British nuclear deterrent at sea was Polaris, the 4 Resolution-class boats and the patrol cycle out of Chevaline. The Soviets never broke it. The patrol cycle has now run unbroken since June 15th, 1968. 58 years of continuous at-sea deterrence, the longest such operation by any nation. But Polaris by the early 1980s was an aging system. The Chevaline modifications had bought time. They had not bought the future. The Chevaline program, when its existence and cost were finally disclosed by the Defence Secretary Francis Pym in a written answer in the House of Commons on January 24, 1980, provoked the most serious row over the British nuclear deterrent of the entire Cold War. The cost was £1 billion at 1980 prices, £530 million more than the original estimate. Successive governments had concealed the programme from Parliament. Harold Wilson's Labour cabinet had specifically excluded ministers other than the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, and the Chancellor from knowledge of it after the February 1974 election. Wilson's Defence Secretary, Roy Mason, did not learn the full scope of what he was overseeing for several months after taking office. Edmund Dell, who served as Paymaster General in 1974-76, and later as Secretary of State for Trade, wrote in his memoirs A Hard Pounding, published in 1991, that he had known nothing of Chevaline as a cabinet minister. Tony Benn, Secretary of State for Energy and then for Industry through the same period, recorded similar ignorance in his diaries. Though Benn had nuclear responsibilities through the Atomic Energy Authority, and might have been expected to know more than he did. The concealment was justified at the time on 2 grounds. The first was operational. The Soviet galosh system around Moscow had to be defeated, and the technical details of how the British proposed to defeat it could not be allowed to leak. The second was political. A substantial wing of the Labour Party would have opposed any expenditure on nuclear weapons, and a public debate would have collapsed the programme. The technical work was done at the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston, with major subcontracts to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough and to Hunting Engineering. The product was a modified Polaris front end carrying 2 warheads, fewer than the original 3, but with extensive penetration aids, chaff, decoys and a manoeuvring bus capable of dispersing the warheads to defeat terminal interception. Whether Chevaline actually worked was, in the 1980s, contested. The first underwater test launch of a Chevaline-equipped Polaris from HMS Renown took place in September 1982 off the Eastern Test Range at Cape Canaveral. The MOD declared the test a success. Sir Ronald Mason, then Chief Scientific Advisor at the Ministry of Defence, told a House of Commons Defence Committee hearing in 1984 that the system met its specification. By then the successor decision had been taken. Margaret Thatcher had written to President Jimmy Carter on July 10, 1980, requesting that the United States supply the Trident 1C4 missile to replace Polaris. The American response formalized in an exchange of letters between Thatcher and Carter dated July 14, 1980, agreed. The Reagan administration's subsequent decision to develop the larger Trident 2D5 led to a renegotiation. On March 11, 1982, Thatcher announced that Britain would purchase the D5 with the first British Vanguard-class submarine to enter service in the mid-1990s. The decision committed the United Kingdom to nuclear weapons through the first quarter of the 21st century. It was taken without a parliamentary vote. The Labour Party, by then committed under Michael Foot to unilateral nuclear disarmament, opposed it. The 1983 general election, fought in part on the issue, returned Thatcher with a majority of 144. The 4 Resolution-class boats would soldier on for another decade. Resolution's last patrol ended in 1994. Repulses in 1996. Their Trident successors took over the deterrent cycle without a gap. In Moscow by 1985, the Soviet Navy had given up. A new General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev, took office on March 11th. Gorbachev's accession did not immediately change the patrol cycle. Resolution-class boats continued to sail from Chevaline on the 8-week rotation through 1985, 1986, 1987. The Reykjavik summit between Gorbachev and Reagan on October 11th to 12th, 1986, produced a brief moment in which the elimination of all ballistic missiles within 10 years appeared possible. Margaret Thatcher, briefed on the outcome by the Foreign Secretary Sir Geoffrey Howe on her return from a visit to South Korea, was reported by her private secretary Charles Powell to have been horrified. She flew to Camp David on November 15, 1986, to confront Reagan personally. The communique issued from the meeting reaffirmed the role of nuclear deterrence and, by implication, the British position. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in Washington on December 8, 1987, eliminated a category of weapons. The cruise missiles based at Greenham Common in Berkshire from November 1983, against which a continuous women's peace camp had protested for the entire period of deployment, and the Soviet SS-20s targeted on Western Europe, but did not touch the submarine-based deterrent. The Polaris patrol cycle continued. In the Northern Fleet headquarters at Severomorsk, the officers who had spent careers hunting British boomers received new orders. The 1988 Soviet naval exercise season was the last conducted at full scale. By 1989, fuel shortages began to ground patrols. By 1990, the Soviet Northern Fleet was sending its boats to sea at a rate roughly half that of 1985. The British acoustic problem ceased to be relevant because the Soviets stopped looking. Vasili Mitrokhin walked into the British Embassy in Riga on March 24, 1992, carrying a sample of his notes. MI6's station chief there, working under diplomatic cover, recognized what he had been offered. The full archive, 6 trunks, 25,000 pages of handwritten notes, copied from the KGB First Chief Directorate's files between 1972 and 1984, reached the United Kingdom over the following 6 months. The material was distributed within Whitehall as the Mitrokhin Papers. Christopher Andrew, the Cambridge historian, was given access in the late 1990s and published the first volume, The Mitrokhin Archive, with Mitrokhin himself as co-author in 1999. Mitrokhin's notes confirmed what the British had inferred. The Soviet Navy had compiled extensive files on the Vanguard program through the Sherwood source at Barrow. It had compiled almost nothing of operational use on the Polaris patrol cycle. The on-station boat had remained throughout the period 1968 to 1991 beyond the reach of Soviet surveillance. The last patrol of the Cold War in any strict sense, taking the Cold War's end, as the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991, was conducted by HMS Repulse. She had sailed from Chevaline on November 14, 1991, with a port crew commanded by Commander Ian Corder. She returned in mid-January 1992. The Soviet Union ceased to exist while she was at sea. The captain was informed by routine VLF broadcast. The patrol continued. the orders did not change. Repulse came home to a country whose strategic adversary had dissolved during her absence, and her crew stepped onto the jetty at Faslane to be told that the war they had spent careers preparing for was over. The boats kept sailing, the cycle continued under Vanguard, then astute support towards Dreadnought. The letters of last resort kept being written, sealed, burnt, replaced. The Faslane silence held.